I came home and realized my daughter-in-law had sold almost everything in my house. The dining table my husband built with his own hands was gone. The bookcases filled with decades of memories had vanished. And standing in the middle of my empty living room, she told me I did not need any of it anymore. What she did not know was that 3 days earlier, I had already made a decision that would change everything she thought she controlled. She believed she was taking my life away piece by piece. In truth, she had just walked straight into a plan she never saw coming. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I am 69 years old. I live on a small piece of farmland just outside Asheville, North Carolina, a place where the mountains rise softly in the distance and the mornings begin with the sound of birds and wind moving through old maple trees. This land has been my home for most of my adult life. It is where my husband and I built our marriage, raised our son, and spent decades believing that family meant safety. The farmhouse itself is not grand, but every corner of it carries a memory. My late husband, Thomas Whitmore, was a patient man who believed that a home should be built with care and time. He was not a professional carpenter, but he loved working with wood. The large oak dining table in the kitchen was shaped by his hands. The tall bookcases in the living room were built one winter when snow kept us indoors for weeks. Even the cabinet beside the fireplace came from a tree that once grew at the edge of our field. After Thomas died 8 years ago, the house grew quieter than I ever imagined possible. The sound of his tools disappeared. The smell of sawdust faded. For a while, I moved through the rooms like a visitor in my own life. That silence was the reason I invited my son, Daniel Whitmore, to move back home with his family. Daniel had recently changed jobs, and he and his wife, Lisa Whitmore, were struggling with the rent in the city. I believed that bringing them here would help everyone. The farm had space, and I thought family belonged together. At first, the arrangement felt like a blessing. Daniel helped repair the old barn and replace sections of the wooden fence that had begun to rot. Lisa organized the kitchen and repainted 2 guest bedrooms. Most importantly, my granddaughter Lily Whitmore filled the house with energy again. She was 9 years old when she arrived, curious about everything, always asking questions about the farm, the garden, and the stories behind every piece of furniture her grandfather had made. For a while, it felt like the house was alive again. But slowly, the atmosphere began to change in ways that were small enough to ignore at first. Lisa often talked about how isolated the farm felt compared to the city. She mentioned that many of her friends had moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where neighborhoods were new and convenient. At first, those conversations sounded harmless, almost like daydreams. Over time, they became more frequent and more pointed. Lisa began describing the farmhouse as outdated. She said the land was too large to maintain and that the property value could fund a better lifestyle somewhere else. She spoke about the farm less as a home and more as an opportunity waiting to be sold. I noticed these comments, but chose not to argue. I had spent my entire career as a chief financial officer for a manufacturing company in Greenville, South Carolina. That work taught me that people reveal their intentions over time if you are patient enough to listen. Daniel rarely disagreed with his wife. He avoided conflict the way some people avoid storms, hoping silence would make problems disappear. When Lisa spoke about selling land or moving away, he usually nodded or changed the subject. Watching that quiet distance grow between us was painful, but I convinced myself that families pass through difficult seasons. The one constant comfort in the house was Lily. She often sat beside me in the kitchen while I cooked, asking about her grandfather and the stories behind the farm. When she laughed, the house felt warm again. Even then, though, I sensed something shifting beneath the surface of our daily routines. Respect, once natural inside these walls, was slowly disappearing. And when respect fades inside a home, something far colder begins to take its place. If you are still watching and this story has caught your attention, comment number 1 below so I know you are here with me. Because what I overheard in my own house that afternoon would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Now let's move on to chapter 2. The afternoon that changed everything began like any other day on the farm. I drove into town that morning to buy vegetable seeds for the spring garden. The small hardware store in Asheville had just received new shipments, and I spent nearly an hour choosing tomato varieties and packets of green bean seeds the way my husband used to. Gardening had become one of the few habits that still connected me to the rhythm of the life Thomas and I built together. The sky was gray when I drove back along the narrow road that led to our farmhouse. Low clouds hung over the mountains, and the air carried the quiet stillness that often comes before rain. Nothing about that day felt unusual. In fact, the calmness of it all made what happened next even harder to believe. As I turned into the gravel driveway, I noticed Daniel's car parked beside the barn. That was strange. My son usually worked until late afternoon at the construction company in town. For a moment, I wondered if he had come home early because something was wrong. I carried the bag of seeds toward the front door and stepped inside the house. The hallway was dim, lit only by the soft afternoon light coming through the kitchen window. I set the seeds on the small table near the stairs and began walking toward the kitchen. That was when I heard Lisa's voice from the living room. Her tone stopped me before I reached the doorway. It sounded sharper and more deliberate than usual, the way people speak when they are negotiating something important. I stood quietly in the hallway without meaning to listen, but her words carried clearly through the open space of the house. She was on the telephone with someone. "Yes, the furniture is old, but that makes it valuable," she said. "Most of it is handmade." My hand rested against the wall as I listened. She began listing items that were inside the house: the oak dining table, the cabinets near the fireplace, the bookcases in the living room. Each piece she described had been built by my husband. Her voice lowered slightly, but I could still hear every word. "We want to move quickly," she continued, "before anyone changes their mind." My chest tightened. I realized that she was not simply talking about furniture. She was planning something. Then she mentioned me. "She will not question the paperwork," Lisa said calmly. "Daniel will handle the signatures." The hallway suddenly felt smaller. My breath slowed as the meaning of her words settled in my mind. This was not a misunderstanding or careless conversation. It was a plan. Lisa paused for a moment, listening to the person on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice sounded almost casual. "After we sell the furniture, we will move her to a nursing facility in Tennessee," she said. "It is much cheaper there." The words felt like cold air moving through my chest. I stepped backward quietly so the floorboards would not creak. I did not want Lisa to know I had heard anything. Within seconds, I was outside again, standing on the porch with the door closed behind me. I walked to my car and sat there without turning on the engine. The farm stretched around me exactly as it always had. The fields were still, the mountains unchanged. But the home I believed I understood was suddenly something else entirely. Instead of going back inside, I drove toward a small park near the edge of town. I sat on a wooden bench and watched children playing while their parents talked nearby. The ordinary scene made the betrayal I had just heard feel even stranger. I thought about the years I spent managing financial contracts and corporate budgets in Greenville. That work taught me patience and caution. As I sat there, one realization became clear. I would not confront them. Not yet, because the most important part of this story had already begun 3 days earlier. If you are still here, and this moment shocked you as much as it shocked me, comment number 2 below to let me know you are still following the story, because the truth I uncovered next proved that the betrayal went even deeper than I first imagined. Now, let's continue with Chapter 3. I woke before sunrise the morning after I overheard Lisa's conversation. Sleep had come in short fragments through the night, each time interrupted by the memory of her calm voice discussing the sale of my belongings and the plan to move me out of my own home. The house was still quiet when I stepped into the kitchen, the same way it had been every morning for decades. Outside the window, the fields were covered with a thin layer of mist, and the mountains beyond Asheville were barely visible in the early light. I brewed coffee and stood by the window, letting the warmth of the mug settle into my hands. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine that everything I heard the day before had been a misunderstanding. That possibility lasted only a few seconds. Years of working in finance had trained me to recognize intention in the smallest details, and nothing about Lisa's conversation had sounded accidental. Daniel came down the stairs a few minutes later. He moved through the kitchen quickly, gathering his keys and lunch container before leaving for work. His face showed no sign that anything unusual was happening inside the house. He greeted me briefly before heading toward the door. I answered with the same calm tone I used every morning, careful not to reveal the storm of thoughts moving through my mind. Once the front door closed behind him, the house fell silent again. Lisa appeared not long afterward, wearing a robe and scrolling through her phone while she made coffee. She asked a casual question about the garden and the seeds I had bought the day before. I noticed that she avoided looking directly at me while she spoke. The behavior might have been nothing, but after what I had heard, every small detail felt important. I decided then that confrontation would only give them time to change their strategy. Instead, I finished my coffee and told Lisa that I was going into town to pick up medication from the pharmacy. She barely reacted, nodding without lifting her eyes from the phone screen. A few minutes later, I was driving south along the highway that leads from Asheville toward Greenville, South Carolina. The mountains slowly faded behind me as the road widened and traffic grew heavier. The drive gave me time to think clearly. During my 30 years as a chief financial officer for a furniture manufacturing company in Greenville, I had reviewed hundreds of contracts. I knew how easily people could hide dishonest intentions inside official documents. That knowledge was the reason I had photographed the papers Daniel asked me to sign the day before. 2 hours later, I arrived at a small brick office building in downtown Greenville. Inside worked Angela Brooks, a lawyer I had known for many years. She had handled property and estate matters for several families connected to my former company, and she was someone whose judgment I trusted. Angela studied the photographs of the documents carefully. Her eyes moved slowly across each page before she placed the phone on the desk. Those papers, she explained quietly, were not insurance forms. They were legal documents intended to transfer ownership of the Whitmore farmhouse and the surrounding land. I listened without surprise. The explanation only confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Then I told Angela something she did not expect. 3 days before overhearing Lisa's conversation, I had visited another legal office and created a protective structure called the Whitmore Family Trust. Ownership of the farmhouse, the farmland, and several investment accounts had already been transferred into that trust. The primary beneficiary was my granddaughter, Lily. Angela understood immediately what that meant. Even if Daniel believed he could manipulate signatures or paperwork, the property was no longer legally mine to give away. As I left the office later that afternoon, I felt something I had not felt since hearing Lisa's voice in the hallway. Control. If you are still watching and wondering how this situation could possibly unfold, comment number 3 below so I know you are still with me, because the decision I made that day would quietly turn the entire situation upside down. Now let's move on to Chapter 4. The drive back from Greenville to Asheville felt longer than usual that evening. The highway curved through familiar hills and forests, but my thoughts stayed fixed on the quiet conversation I had just had with Angela Brooks. For the first time since overhearing Lisa's phone call, I felt steady again. The Whitmore Family Trust had already secured the land, the house, and the investments that Daniel believed he could take from me. What remained now was patience. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the farmhouse looked exactly as it always had. Lights spilled from the kitchen windows, and the porch lamp glowed softly above the front steps. Nothing about the house suggested that the people inside it were quietly planning to remove me from my own life. Daniel was in the living room when I entered, leaning back on the sofa with the television playing low in the background. Lisa sat in the armchair beside him, her attention fixed on her phone. They both looked up briefly when I walked through the doorway. I greeted them the same way I always did and carried my purse to the kitchen counter. I asked simple questions about their day and spoke about the weather and the garden. My voice sounded calm, even to my own ears. Years of working in corporate offices had taught me how to keep my expression neutral when situations became uncomfortable. Dinner that night was quiet and ordinary. I prepared a simple meal, washed the dishes afterward, and moved through the evening routine exactly as I had done for years. If either Daniel or Lisa felt nervous about their plans, they hid it well. They spoke about everyday matters while avoiding any topic that might draw attention to the documents Daniel had asked me to sign. Over the next several days, I watched the house carefully. Lisa began spending long hours with her laptop open at the dining table. Sometimes she walked from room to room, holding her phone and taking photographs. I recognized the pattern immediately. During my years as a chief financial officer, I had overseen asset sales that required the same type of documentation. She photographed the oak dining table Thomas built during our first winter on the farm. She photographed the cabinet beside the fireplace and the tall bookcases that held decades of family photographs and old novels. Each image felt like a quiet removal of memory. I said nothing. Instead, I began recording details the way I once recorded financial transactions. In a small notebook beside my bed, I wrote the dates and times when Lisa photographed furniture or when Daniel discussed potential buyers. I also used my phone to record conversations that drifted through the house when they believed I was not paying attention. Their confidence grew quickly once the first listings appeared online. I overheard them discussing responses from people interested in the furniture. Daniel sounded slightly uneasy during those conversations, but Lisa seemed energized by the progress. Her voice carried a tone of impatience, as though she believed the farmhouse and everything inside it already belonged to her. The first buyer arrived on a quiet afternoon later that week. I stood in the kitchen while Lisa showed the visitor the oak dining table in the dining room. The man walked slowly around it, running his hand across the polished surface that Thomas had sanded by hand years ago. Watching someone evaluate that table as a product rather than a memory felt strange, but I kept my composure. My silence was part of the plan now. That night, after the house grew quiet again, I sat on the edge of my bed reviewing the notes and recordings I had gathered. Each entry strengthened the record of what Daniel and Lisa were doing. They believed they were slowly removing my life piece by piece. What they did not realize was that every step they took was quietly building the evidence I would eventually need. If you are still here and curious about how far their plan would go, comment number 4 below so I know you are following along. Because what I walked into when I returned home later would become the moment everything finally exploded. Let's continue with Chapter 5. The afternoon I returned to the farmhouse, the road leading up to the property felt unusually quiet. The mountains around Asheville were wrapped in a thin layer of cloud, and the gravel beneath my tires sounded louder than usual. I had spent several hours away from the house running errands in town, partly because I needed supplies, and partly because I wanted to give Daniel and Lisa time to continue whatever they believed they were accomplishing. As I approached the barn, I noticed a truck parked near the side of the driveway. It was not Daniel's vehicle, and it did not belong to any neighbor I recognized. A faint sense of confirmation settled in my chest. Something inside the house had already changed. The front door stood slightly open when I walked up the porch steps. I pushed it gently and stepped into the hallway. For a moment, I thought I had entered the wrong house. The living room was nearly empty. The sofa that had sat against the far wall for years was gone. The tall bookcases Thomas built one winter had disappeared. Pale shapes on the carpet marked the places where furniture once stood, like quiet shadows of a life that had been carefully arranged over decades. I moved slowly across the room, letting my eyes adjust to the sudden emptiness. Every step across the wooden floor echoed through the house in a way I had never heard before. The dining room looked even stranger. Only a few cardboard boxes remained against the wall. The oak dining table my husband had crafted with such patience had vanished. I could still picture the way sunlight used to fall across its polished surface every morning. As I stood there absorbing the scene, Lisa appeared in the hallway leading from the kitchen. Her expression shifted quickly when she saw me, moving from surprise to something closer to irritation. She began explaining the situation in a tone that suggested everything was perfectly reasonable. According to her, several buyers had already purchased the larger pieces of furniture, and they would return later to collect what remained. She spoke as if the decisions had been ordinary household arrangements. I listened without interrupting. Then I walked back into the center of the living room and sat down slowly on the bare wooden floor. The boards were cool beneath my hands, and the empty space around me made the house feel larger than it had ever been. Lisa stopped speaking when she noticed I was smiling. The reaction clearly confused her. She had probably expected anger, tears, or shock. Instead, I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. I pressed play on one of the recordings I had saved earlier in the week. The sound of familiar voices filled the quiet room. Daniel and Lisa discussing furniture sales. Lisa explaining how quickly the items needed to disappear. The calm confidence in their voices echoed off the empty walls. Lisa's expression changed immediately. Before either of them could react further, I explained that the recordings were only part of what had been documented. One of the buyers who visited the house earlier that week had not come merely to purchase furniture. He had been hired as a private investigator by Angela Brooks, the attorney I consulted in Greenville. Every conversation during those visits had been recorded. Daniel's face lost its color as the meaning settled in. I then placed a folder on the floor beside me. Inside were legal documents prepared by Angela outlining the consequences of selling property without the owner's consent. Lisa responded by suggesting that the farmhouse itself could be sold to recover the money. That was when I calmly revealed the final truth. The farmhouse and the surrounding farmland no longer belonged to me personally. 3 days earlier, they had been transferred into the Whitmore Family Trust. The beneficiary of that trust was my granddaughter Lily. Silence filled the empty room. Daniel and Lisa finally understood that the plan they believed had secured their future had already collapsed before it began. The silence that followed my explanation felt heavier than anything that had happened before. I was still sitting on the wooden floor of the living room, surrounded by the empty space where our furniture had once stood. The house no longer felt like the warm place Thomas and I had built together. It felt like a stage after a performance, stripped bare and echoing with the memory of what had once been there. Daniel stood near the doorway, his hands hanging at his sides as though he had forgotten what they were meant to do. The color had drained from his face. His eyes moved slowly from the empty walls to the folder of legal papers lying on the floor beside me. Lisa reacted differently. Her expression hardened quickly, as if anger had replaced the shock she felt moments earlier. She folded her arms and stared at me with disbelief, refusing to accept that the situation had shifted beyond her control. I rose slowly from the floor, brushing a small trace of dust from my skirt. My knees ached slightly from sitting on the wood, but the movement itself felt important. For years, I had quietly adapted to the decisions others made around me. Standing there in the center of the empty room, I realized that moment had finally ended. I explained the legal situation calmly, the same way I once explained financial contracts during meetings in Greenville. The Whitmore Family Trust now held ownership of the farmhouse and the surrounding farmland. The transfer had been completed days before Daniel placed those papers in front of me to sign. That meant the documents he believed would give him control over the property were already meaningless. The trust protected everything. Neither Daniel nor Lisa had the authority to sell the land or the house. More importantly, the beneficiary of that trust was Lily. The property was no longer part of any decision they could manipulate. Daniel lowered his eyes when the reality became clear. He understood that the plan they had spent days organizing had already collapsed before the first piece of furniture left the house. Lisa, however, continued searching for a way to dismiss the situation. She spoke about the sales as if they were harmless family decisions rather than deliberate actions taken behind my back. Her tone suggested she still believed that pressure or argument could force me to reverse what had been done. I did not argue. Instead, I pointed to the folder containing the documents Angela Brooks had prepared. Inside were descriptions of the legal consequences that could follow if the situation moved forward through the court system. Financial exploitation and unauthorized sale of personal property were not small matters. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. He asked what would happen next. I told him the truth. The recordings I had captured in the house, combined with the footage gathered by the investigator Angela hired, created a detailed record of everything that had happened during the past week. The furniture had been sold without my authorization. Conversations planning those sales had been documented. What happened next depended on the choices they made now. I picked up the folder from the floor and walked toward the hallway. Neither Daniel nor Lisa tried to stop me. The house was so quiet that the sound of my footsteps echoed faintly against the walls. When I stepped outside onto the porch, the late afternoon air felt cool and steady. The farmland stretched out in front of me just as it always had. The mountains beyond Asheville remained calm, indifferent to the conflict that had just unfolded inside the house. For the first time since hearing Lisa's voice in the hallway days earlier, I understood something clearly. Daniel and Lisa believed they had been controlling my future, but the truth was much simpler. My future had already been secured. If you are still watching and want to see what consequences come next, comment number 6 below to let me know you are still here with me. Because what happened after that confrontation forced everyone in the house to face the truth. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The morning after the confrontation felt strangely quiet. I woke early in a small bed and breakfast on the edge of Asheville, where I had decided to spend the night rather than return immediately to the farmhouse. The room was simple, with a window facing the distant mountains and a narrow porch that overlooked a line of pine trees. I sat there for a long time with a cup of coffee, watching the morning fog lift slowly from the valley. For decades, my life had followed a pattern shaped by the rhythm of the farm. Sunrise usually meant work in the garden, feeding chickens, or walking through the fields to check fences. That morning felt different. My body was in the same mountains where I had always lived, but my thoughts were still inside the empty living room I had left the day before. I did not feel triumph. what I felt was something more complicated. Daniel was still my son. The realization did not disappear simply because he had allowed himself to be drawn into Lisa's plan. That truth made the situation heavier than I had expected. Protecting myself had been necessary, but the cost of doing so was now impossible to ignore. My phone rang shortly after 8 in the morning. The number on the screen belonged to Angela Brooks in Greenville. Her voice sounded calm and focused when I answered. She explained that she had already begun preparing the legal documents related to the situation at the farmhouse. The recordings I captured and the footage obtained by the investigator created a strong record of events. Several furniture transactions had been documented, and those sales involved property that legally belonged to me at the time. Angela described the possible steps we could take. A formal complaint involving financial exploitation and unauthorized property sales was one option. Another option would begin with a legal demand requiring Daniel and Lisa to account for every item they sold and the money they received. I listened carefully while she outlined the strategy. My years working as a financial executive had taught me that legal processes move carefully but rarely without direction once evidence is involved. After the call ended, I remained on the porch for a while longer, thinking about what would happen next. Justice and family are rarely simple ideas when they collide. Later that afternoon, I returned to the farmhouse. The house felt even emptier than it had the day before. The living room walls looked wider without the tall bookcases Thomas had built. Sunlight fell across the wooden floor where the dining table once stood. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked inside. He looked tired in a way I had never seen before. His shoulders slumped slightly, and his eyes followed me with a mixture of worry and uncertainty. Lisa stood near the counter, her expression tight with frustration. I explained calmly that the situation was now being handled by Angela Brooks. Letters had already been prepared outlining the legal claims connected to the furniture sales. The matter would not simply disappear. Neither of them argued with me. Daniel lowered his head while I spoke. Lisa remained silent, but the tension in her posture revealed how quickly her confidence had faded. As I walked through the empty rooms later that evening, I realized the farmhouse had become a physical reminder of the decisions they had made. Every missing piece of furniture told part of the story, and those empty spaces made it impossible for anyone in that house to pretend that nothing had happened. Several days passed after the legal letters from Angela Brooks arrived. During that time, the farmhouse became quieter than I had ever known it. The empty spaces left by the missing furniture were constant reminders of what had happened. Every room seemed larger and colder without the familiar objects that once filled them. The living room was the most difficult place to walk through. Without the bookcases and chairs, the walls felt exposed, and the wooden floor carried the echo of every step. Sunlight still entered through the same windows each morning, but it fell across bare boards instead of the polished surfaces my husband had once crafted with such patience. Daniel moved through the house carefully, almost as if he feared disturbing something fragile. He spoke very little during those days. When he did speak, his voice sounded uncertain. I could see the weight of the situation settling on him more clearly with each passing day. Lisa reacted differently. She spent long hours on her phone and computer, sometimes speaking quietly with people who had purchased the furniture. The frustration in her posture was impossible to miss. Whatever confidence she once had about the plan was slowly fading as the legal reality became impossible to ignore. I spent most of my time outside. The garden needed attention, and the familiar routine of working the soil helped steady my thoughts. The rows of vegetables did not care about the conflict unfolding inside the house. Plants responded only to sunlight, water, and patience. In many ways, the garden felt more honest than the rooms inside the farmhouse. Angela continued sending updates from Greenville. The investigator she hired had contacted several buyers who purchased furniture from the house. Some of them cooperated immediately, explaining when they visited the farm and how the transactions had taken place. Online sales listings and payment records created a clear timeline of events. One evening, Daniel approached me while I was standing in the kitchen washing vegetables from the garden. His footsteps were hesitant, and he stopped a few feet away as though unsure how close he should stand. His face looked older than it had only a week earlier. He explained that the letters from Angela had made the situation clear. He had begun contacting buyers himself, asking whether the furniture could be returned or whether the payments could be refunded. Some people had already responded. Others were still deciding how to handle the situation. I listened quietly while he spoke. The words came slowly, as if he was struggling to organize thoughts he had avoided for too long. He admitted that financial pressure had pushed him into decisions he should never have made. Selling the property had seemed like an easy solution to problems that felt overwhelming at the time. Lisa remained distant from these conversations. She rarely spoke directly to me and often left the room when I entered. Her silence carried a mixture of anger and unease. As the days passed, I realized that apologies alone would not repair what had been broken. Trust does not return simply because someone regrets losing it. One evening, I walked through the garden while the sun set behind the mountains. The fields were calm, unchanged by the arguments and legal letters that had filled the house. Standing there among the quiet rows of plants, I understood something clearly. Responsibility always arrives eventually. The only question left was whether Daniel and Lisa would truly accept it. If you are still here and want to discover how this story finally ends, comment number 8 below, so I know you stayed until the final part. Because the choices made next would decide whether this family could ever rebuild what was broken. Now, let's move to the final chapters and the conclusion. Several weeks passed after the legal letters were sent, and the first wave of tension settled over the farmhouse. Time has a way of slowing things down when people are forced to face the consequences of their choices. The house was still missing some of the furniture that once filled it, but the empty spaces no longer felt as sharp as they did in the beginning. I returned to my routine as much as possible. Each morning I walked through the garden behind the house, checking the soil and watering the rows of vegetables that had begun to grow. The quiet work helped steady my thoughts. The land had always been patient, and I found comfort in that patience. Angela Brooks continued guiding the legal process from her office in Greenville. She updated me regularly about the progress Daniel was making. Several buyers who purchased furniture from the farmhouse agreed to return the items after learning about the situation. Others had already moved the pieces far away, which meant Daniel needed to return the money instead. Watching him correct those mistakes was not easy. Daniel began working longer hours at the construction company and taking extra shifts on weekends. The effort showed in his face. He looked tired most evenings when he came home, but there was something different about the way he carried himself. The confidence he once had was gone, replaced by a quiet determination to repair what he had damaged. Lisa struggled more with the situation. She helped Daniel contact buyers and manage the financial payments, but the frustration in her posture remained visible. Accepting responsibility did not come naturally to her. Even so, the reality of the legal consequences left little room for denial. Gradually, a few pieces of furniture returned to the farmhouse. One afternoon, Daniel carried the oak dining table back through the front door with the help of a neighbor. Seeing it in the dining room again felt strange at first, as if the house was trying to remember its original shape. The table looked exactly the same as it always had, though the circumstances around it were very different. Later that evening, Daniel approached me with a folder of papers. Inside were records showing which buyers had returned furniture and which payments had been refunded. The documents were organized carefully, something I noticed immediately after years of reviewing financial reports. I studied the papers without speaking for several moments. The work he had done was real. Correcting the situation would take time, but the effort had clearly begun. My granddaughter Lily remained the quiet center of the household during those weeks. She still spent afternoons in the kitchen asking questions about the garden and helping me bake. Watching her move through the house reminded me why I had created the Whitmore Family Trust in the first place. The farm was never only about land or buildings. It was about protecting something that could continue long after the conflicts between adults faded away. Forgiveness, I realized, grows slowly. Much like the garden behind the house, it requires time, patience, and a willingness to care for something that has been damaged. Several months have passed since the day I sat on the bare wooden floor of my living room and listened to my own family realize that their plan had already fallen apart. Time did not erase what happened, but it slowly softened the sharp edges of those memories. The farmhouse outside Asheville began to feel like home again, though it was not exactly the same as before. Some of the furniture Daniel managed to recover now stood in their old places. The oak dining table returned to the center of the dining room, its surface still smooth beneath the light from the window. Other spaces remained empty, quiet reminders of how easily trust can be broken. Life moved forward in small, steady ways. Each morning, I stepped outside into the garden, walking between rows of vegetables that had grown strong during the summer. Working the soil gave me time to think without the noise of arguments or legal papers. The land had always been patient, and that patience helped me regain my balance. Daniel continued working long hours to repay the money connected to the furniture that could not be recovered. The effort changed him in ways I had not expected. He spoke more carefully now, and listened more than he once did. The distance between us had not disappeared, but it was no longer filled with anger. Lisa's behavior also shifted over time. She remained quieter than before and focused on helping Daniel repair the financial damage they had caused. The tension that once defined every room of the house slowly faded into something less hostile. The person who seemed least affected by the conflict was my granddaughter Lily. She still spent afternoons in the kitchen, asking questions about the garden and learning how to bake the same apple pies her grandfather once loved. Watching her move through the house reminded me why I had created the Whitmore Family Trust in the first place. The farm was never simply property. It was a promise that the future could remain protected even when the present became uncertain. One evening, I sat on the porch as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The fields stretched quietly across the land, unchanged by everything that had happened inside the house. In that moment, I understood the most important lesson this experience had given me. Respect is not something we should surrender in order to keep peace. Sometimes protecting your dignity is the only way to give a family the chance to become better than it once was. In the end, life has a quiet way of revealing what truly matters. Possessions can disappear, plans can fall apart, and even the people we trust most can disappoint us. But dignity, once protected, becomes a foundation no one else can take away. Real strength is not found in anger or revenge. It is found in the courage to set boundaries, to stand firm when respect is threatened, and to move forward with wisdom instead of bitterness. Sometimes the hardest lessons arrive through betrayal, yet those lessons shape a future built on clarity and self-worth. When we choose dignity over silence, we reclaim our voice and our peace. Thank you for spending time with this story. If it touched something in your heart, share your thoughts in the comments and let others know where you are watching from. And if you enjoy stories about strength, resilience, and life lessons, please follow and subscribe so you will not miss the next one.